Corruption by P.K. Armstrong. Chapter 23. As the rain hit her windshield on the way to meet Ruth Mayberry, she was reminded of rainy days at home when she was little. Her mom was a firm believer in letting children play in puddles, returning home to discard wet, messy clothing, and then baking cookies. The warm thoughts of home gave Angel an idea, and she dialed her mom's number. Mom, you wouldn't happen to be free this afternoon? Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. I just had my last patient for the day, her mom responded. I made an appointment to talk with Ruth Mayberry. Can you sit in? I think we need to ask some different sort of questions. Of course, come to the house. Angel, did something else happen? I got a call from Aiden at Sinclair Academy. Violet returned from a school trip and told him that someone followed her. Francine Dale gasped. Angel? I know. It changes everything, especially if, as Christopher and I suspect, it was Stan Granger who was watching her. Christopher was with you? Angel laughed to herself at her mother's not so subtle attempt to get information about her and Christopher. No, I called him after I got off the phone with Aiden and he met me there. I think it was good to have us both there. Violet was actually really calm about the whole thing. I will call the school psychologist and give her some instructions in case Violet has a delayed reaction. Her mom was ever the psychiatrist. Thanks, Mom. We'll be with you shortly. The traffic was beginning to slow due to the rain, and Angel slowed with it, mindful of the oil on the streets that had yet to be washed away. Her lights had come on, and ever a cautious driver, she waited until she had come to the next traffic light before she dialed Ruth Mayberry to change the location of their meeting. Ruth agreed readily, and Angel made her way to the house. Ruth Mayberry sipped her coffee appreciatively. She, Angel, and Francine were ensconced in the kitchen of the Dale home. Since it was past lunch and too early for dinner, Francine had prepared 2 plates full of ham and cheddar and turkey and provolone sliders with fruit and yogurt. Angel, who only had a protein bar for breakfast and had missed a lunch because she had been at Sinclair Academy with Violet, ate 2 of the sandwiches before she even spoke. Angel pulled out her tablet and slid it across the kitchen table towards Ruth. Ruth put her coffee mug down and picked up the tablet, which was displaying a picture of the list found with the body of Simon Rain. She read each name and then put the tablet down, looking at Angel pointedly. Where did this list come from? My client acquired it. Ruth Mayberry's eyebrow went up with a harumph. Acquired? Angel ignored the question. What can you tell me about the names on this list? Angel asked. At one time or another, they were all targets of the task force, Ruth put simply. Angel did not want to show her brief alarm knowing that Christopher's name was at the bottom of the list, so she concentrated on slowly opening her notepad. Start with the first name. Ruth took another sip of coffee and bit into a sandwich, all the while looking at the list. Andrew Vernon was a flashy sort. He wore expensive clothes, drove a luxury car, had a big house, and took supersized vacations. His wife's social media accounts are what put him on the radar. He never went higher than a patrol officer. What is the top salary for that position? 80, 90K? Angel guessed. Ruth nodded. Yes. In addition, he had an ex-wife and 2 kids. Basically, a lot of money going out, but no legitimate source for the matching amounts that should have been coming in. Can you tell me what kind of man he is? Francine asked. What do you mean? Ruth asked with a confused look. You say he has an ex-wife and kids. Do you know why his first marriage ended? Francine clarified. Ruth nodded. Oh, I see. Well, Andrew Vernon is a bit of a jerk, very full of himself. I typed up the interview of his ex-wife, and frankly, he spent the whole of the marriage belittling her. You should be glad someone like me married someone like you, sort of thing. She said he constantly bullied their son and daughter, often criticizing them if they got even the smallest things wrong. She knew he had more money than his biweekly pay, and he was stingy with it, but couldn't tell investigators where it was from. She did confirm that she had no recent inheritance, and to her knowledge, neither had he. She had enough of the abuse and lies and filed for divorce. Angel looked at her mom, who nodded, so she asked about the next name on the list. And Craig James? Ruth tapped her lip with a finger in contemplation. Hmm. Oh, yes, Craig James. He was the baby of the group. Only on patrol for 3 months when Andrew Vernon was assigned as his TO, training officer. She shook her head and took a sip of coffee. It seems Andrew Vernon started grooming Craig James from the beginning. It started small, taking free food, drinks, and snacks from stores in the community, to bigger things, like taking bribes and sexual favors to avoid arrest. Craig James didn't have a chance. He went along with whatever his TO wanted him to do. She grabbed another sandwich and bit into it. It was kind of sad. Craig James came from a family of cops. His dad, a brother, an uncle, and a cousin. When he admitted guilt and lost his badge, they were devastated. Angel decided to take a break from notes and began clearing her dishes. It gave her time to think. It seemed like all of the officers on the list were of low rank. Was there a ringleader? She made more coffee and carried it back to the table where her mother and Ruth had taken a break as well and were comparing notes on gardening. Angel refreshed everyone's cup and sat back down. So, who is next? She looked at the list. Let's talk about David Sorensen. He is a real piece of work, Ruth spoke plainly. He is the very definition of corruption. He and Andrew are running buddies. From what we could discover, they are the ones that came up with the idea of the repair shop. Andrew Vernon spent time in an auto theft unit for the sheriff's office, and some of their suppliers were actually suspects in the very cases he worked. Wow, Angel and her mom said at the same time. Yeah, from what we can tell, David Sorensen was the accountant of the bunch. He was part of the white collar crimes unit of the Attorney General's office. Ruth stopped as if she just remembered something and looked at Francine. If I was going to tell you something about David Sorensen, it would be that I don't think he was bad in a sociopathic way. When I watched and transcribed interviews with him, he just seemed, well, bored. That's an interesting observation, Francine acknowledged. Actually, you may have heard of his family, Sorensen Farms? It was Francine that made the connection. Oh, Angel, that's where you used to take horse riding lessons when you were little. Remember, we used to go Saturday mornings. I think there are pictures somewhere around here. Angel nodded absent-mindedly. She was finally getting to the name that interested her the most. So I know you told my dad about Stan Granger. Would you mind telling me what you know about his relationship with the witness at the auto shop? Ruth nodded. The auto shop was failing before it was bought out by Stan Granger and his partners. Andrew Vernon, Craig James, David Sorensen, and Stan Granger were all partners? Yes, but remember, no one knew about Sorensen at first, and the witness left Stan Granger out altogether, though the investigation eventually uncovered his involvement. I think Andrew Vernon, David Sorensen, and Stan Granger all put money in, but Craig James wasn't a full partner. They just intimidated him into doing their dirty work. They bought the auto shop at below market value because it was failing. We also think the original owner may have been motivated to sell, but we could never locate him to ask. Cindy Mailer worked for the original owner. When she was first contacted by the task force, she seemed willing enough to provide information about Andrew Vernon. But at some point, the investigators realized that during the time of some of the business transactions attributed to Andrew Vernon, it was proven that he was elsewhere. So investigators confronted Cindy Mailer and she began stalling, Angel concluded. Ruth Mayberry nodded again. They were able to get search warrants based on her testimony, but in the end, while they had ownership papers, there was no paper trail to connect Vernon, Granger, or Sorensen to the price gouging or stolen parts, which is why nothing could be done. Why didn't they just fire them? Francine asked. Once again, no concrete evidence, Ruth responded, and Angel added. The union would have squashed any attempt to fire those officers without sufficient evidence. Exactly. They were all warned off ownership of the auto shop, and I think they may have sold it on, and Cindy Mailer and her daughter disappeared. Angel nodded and looked at her notepad where she had drawn connecting lines between Stan Granger, Cindy Mailer, and the child with a question mark. How do you know the child was Granger's? When investigators threatened her with a DNA test, she admitted it. Granger did too when they interviewed him after their disappearance. She paused to eat some fruit and drink more coffee. I think everyone concluded that Cindy Mailer took off without the girl. Why would she do something like that? Angel asked. It doesn't seem she had anything to fear from the task force or Granger. Well, since she fiddled her account of the auto shop operations and left Granger out, maybe she thought they would charge her, Francine speculated. But why leave the child? Angel queried, and then, wait, how do you know she left the child? Because Cindy Mailer was spotted a couple of times by associates during the weeks after the investigation and internal hearings concluded, and the little girl was never with her. Ruth looked at Angel. You know she had a roommate, right? Angel nodded, and Ruth sat for a second, tapping her fingers on the table until she gave her head a shake. For the life of me, I can't remember the roommate's name, but they were sure it was the roommate that took the child. Why did they conclude that? Angel asked curiously. It doesn't seem to be a logical thing to do. They went back and interviewed neighbors. One admitted seeing the roommate load the car with luggage, and another who saw her put the little girl in the car seat. She sighed. No one knows their whereabouts for sure, and it seemed that Stan Granger didn't care. Investigators confronted him because at first they suspected he may have killed her for snitching, Ruth replied. Not the type, Francine muttered under her breath. Ruth continued. But in the end, he convinced them that he hadn't heard from her. Ruth gave Angel a look of disgust. Basically, Craig James came out of it the worst. He lost his job and ruined his family. Like I said, there is no telling what happened to Cindy and her little girl. And Vernon, Sorensen, and Granger all got a slap on the wrist and just moved on. She paused, probably deeper into corruption. I see. Angel drew a slow breath and finally asked about the last name on the list. The last name, Christopher Roland. He was targeted by the task force as well? Ruth Mayberry shook her head and shrugged her shoulders at the same time. Not really. You see, Christopher Roland was Stan Granger's partner for a few months before Granger purchased the auto shop. Roland left the sheriff's office a month before the enterprise began, and the task force wondered what motivated the move. I don't know if you know him or not, but he's a pretty straight shooter. He follows standard operating procedure and doesn't really make waves. He didn't need to. He was one of the best investigators at the sheriff's office. His reputation was encouraging because if he knew something, he most certainly would report it. In the end, according to the way Stan Granger told it, he asked Sorensen if they should bring Roland in on their deal, but Sorensen nixed it, saying that Roland was too righteous and they couldn't use him. What do you think about Andrew Vernon? Angel asked her mom. After Ruth Mayberry left, they moved to the porch and curled up on the couch where Angel reviewed her notes and pulled out a pen to add her mom's thoughts on what Ruth had revealed. Definitely not the ringleader. People have their arenas, their stages where they perform. He acts out at home because he has no power anywhere else. She contemplated what Ruth had said about Vernon. Someone like him with no real power, being included in a criminal enterprise probably gave him the prestige he was craving. Angel scribbled her mom's insights on the page she had reserved for Andrew Vernon. She turned the page. And Sorensen? Out of everyone on the list, he worries me the most. Why? Francine Dale sighed. because no one suspected his involvement, and even though his partners were risking their livelihoods and reputations, not once did they give him up. Ruth Mayberry described him as being bored, but I suspect he is extremely intelligent, since he seems to be the brains behind the operation. He is probably manipulative, able to get people to do what he wants them to do. People might be scared to cross him because he is cold and unfeeling. They don't know where they stand with him. Sounds like someone that wouldn't have a problem cutting off the finger of a little old lady or killing her son, Angel surmised. Francine nodded. Which brings us to Stan Granger. He's a bit of a puzzle because his behavior can be explained in a couple of ways. He could just be someone who wants more money, more power, and he uses his status as a police officer and criminal activities to gain what he wants. Angel stared at her mom. Or, or he's just a man who wants to take care of his own and uses criminal activity to fill in where his legitimate income is lacking. So you're saying Granger might have a good reason for committing crimes? Sometimes people do the wrong things for the right reasons. He could have gotten a security job on the side. Most good cops do if their salaries come up short. I know, Angel, I'm not condoning, but I'm trying to analyze whether or not he's a threat to Violet. You do think he's the one that was at the Science Museum? Angel was embarrassed. She had not thought about the implications herself. Sorry, you're right. I need to get with Roland to find out if he's confirmed that it was Stan Granger watching Violet, but yes, that is what we are assuming. Francine nodded. Did you get me more information on Simon Rain? Yes. Angel stood up and went to retrieve her bag by the front door where she left it when she had arrived. She returned and plopped back down on the couch nearer to her mother so they could look at the file together. Simon Rain was raised by a hard-working single mother. She worked long shifts at a factory to provide for her small son. Included in the report by a social worker who was called to the home when Simon got into several fights at school was that Simon lacked for nothing, including new basketball sneakers, football gear, and a new music player. Francine said in a thoughtful way as she read the documents. What? Angel waited. She knew she had to give her mom time to formulate her opinions. Christopher mentioned he started working at a really young age, 13, washing cars at a local car dealership. It made me wonder if he was being taken care of, but this shows clearly that his mom provided for him. So why did he start working? Why do you think? Well, at the time he was growing up, he and his mother were probably treated like second-class citizens. He was probably teased for not having a father. She paused and looked at Angel, who perused the social worker's report. Angel nodded, and she continued. For some children, even though they are well taken care of, loved even, they become bitter and resent their origins. They begin to spend their lives trying to obtain the status they were denied. Take a look at this. He went from washing cars to selling them. Then he took business classes. He attempted to get into an Ivy League college 3 times. 3 times! Can you imagine how frustrating? He finished at a state school and probably has made a point to do deals with the same class of people that rejected him all his life. Don't get me wrong, Simon Rain probably loved and respected his mother very much. Looking at the financials, Angel confirmed her mother's suppositions. Yes, it looks like he put 50,000 down on 1464 Blackbird Lane. She continued her mother's train of thought. She was also kidnapped. Someone had to know that his mother was important to him. She stood up and began pacing. Her mother's insights were triggering questions, questions that she would have to answer. But there was one more important question for which she needed her mother's expertise. Why would a man like Simon Rain have a list of cops, dirty or otherwise? What would he have to gain? Well, you've already reached one definite conclusion. A man like Simon Rain does nothing unless he will gain from it. The cops on that list are in positions of authority. She looked at the list and crossed out Andrew Vernon and Craig James. I think Sorensen is calling the shots, but Stan is your linchpin. Once you find out what Simon Rain wanted from them, you will probably find out what got him killed. My first guess would be blackmail.